Okay, in today's lesson we were talking about how to graph quadrilaterals, but before we get to the graphing, we are going to do some sometimes, always, never questions to really understand what is going on. Okay, so our first one, we have a square is a rectangle. Well, let's go to the rectangle criteria. In order for something to be a rectangle, opposite sides are congruent, two sets of parallel sides, and all angles are 90 degrees. Okay? Well, a square does that. It says all sides are congruent, which means that opposite sides are congruent. Two sets of parallel sides, well, it has that, and all angles are 90 degrees. So a square is always a rectangle. Okay? However, the opposite, a rectangle is a square. Well, a rectangle is only a square if all sides are congruent. So a rectangle is sometimes a square. Now, a square is a rhombus. Okay, well, let's go to rhombus. Rhombus says all sides are congruent, two sets of parallel sides, opposite angles are congruent. Okay, well, a square has all sides are congruent, two sets of parallel sides, but all angles are 90 degrees, which means that opposite angles are congruent. So a square is always a rhombus. But a rhombus is sometimes a square, because sometimes a rhombus is opposite angles are 90. Okay? A rhombus is a rectangle. A rhombus is a rectangle. Well, if we look at a rectangle, opposite sides are congruent, two sets of parallel sides, all angles are 90 degrees. Well, if a square is always a rhombus and a rhombus is sometimes a square, then a rhombus is also sometimes a rectangle. Now, a rectangle, opposite sides are congruent, two sets of parallel sides, all angles are 90 degrees. Well, a rectangle is sometimes, a rhombus is always a rectangle, but a rectangle is sometimes a rhombus if the rectangle happens to be a square. Okay, but a rhombus is always a rectangle because it's always got sides congruent, two sets of parallel sides. Oh, nope, I lied. Rhombus is sometimes a rectangle. Okay, I was right the first time, sorry. It's sometimes because opposite angles are congruent is the key thing. For it to be a rectangle, all angles are 90 degrees. Okay, so a rhombus is sometimes a rectangle when that rhombus is a square. Okay, a rectangle is a rhombus sometimes because sometimes a rectangle is a square. Okay, a trapezoid has one set of parallel sides. If we go to trapezoid, one set of parallel sides, yep, always, regardless if it's isosceles or not. Okay, a parallelogram has two sets of congruent sides. Parallelogram has two sets of congruent sides. Opposite sides are congruent. That is always. A trapezoid has one set of congruent sides. Well, an isosceles trapezoid has one set of congruent sides, but a normal or a non-isosceles trapezoid does not, which means that this is sometimes. A kite has perpendicular diagonals. Diagonals are perpendicular, so that is always. A kite has one pair of opposite angles that are congruent. No, a kite has two pairs of congruent consecutive sides. A kite has one pair of opposite angles that are congruent. That is always as well. Okay? So other than the blunder of the rhombus is a rectangle being sometimes, these are your sometimes, always, never questions.